Okay, so I want to talk some more about the HPA axis. Specifically, one of the things that's come up on the channel that I've seen in some of the comments would be a misunderstanding of cortisol and the cortisol curve and HPA axis dysfunction. So, allow me to explain more. I think one of the points I've emphasized has been the fact that when you're under chronic stress, PTSD, bad relationship, a chronic illness, chronic mental health concern, any of these things that disrupt the HPA axis typically tend to cause a hypercortisol state or hypercortisol spikes, right? Due to the stress, you spike cortisol. The point I've emphasized less is the fact that over time, especially if you look at Hans Selye's research, basically then cortisol's high for a while and seems to stay high or comes down more reluctantly. But eventually it can actually go to the other end. It can crash and you have limited cortisol or not enough cortisol. So one of the things that happens is it like I said, in time, one first has this hypercortisol state. So what you will notice would be symptoms like increased anxiety, increased startling, increased like a hypervigilance, difficulty sleeping, kind of feeling edgy is a good way to put it, wired. That happens typically early on in this whole HPA axis dysfunction picture. And then, like I said, it can swing to the other end, and what you see then would be exhaustion and very low energy, particularly in the morning when someone is supposed to be getting out of bed. So rising, an inability to get up on time, especially chronically. I'm not talking about, I had a night where I was out late and now it's really hard to rip myself out of bed. But if every single morning you can't pull yourself from the pillow, that could be a sign that your cortisol is actually not it's not adequate. The levels are too low. Because what happens is you really have two hormones kind of in tension. You have cortisol that's secreted from the adrenals, and it gets secreted around an hour to a half hour before you wake. And so that it's at its highest right then is the spike. Kind of think of a ski slope. Think of a black diamond ski slope, right? So it's going to be highest around 6 a.m., let's say, if you're going to get up at 7. And then what happens is over the course of the day, it falls such that then when it's time to go to sleep, it should be really, or even during sleep, it should still be falling. And then the other side, the other end, if you think in terms of let's think of a teeter-totter. I don't know if anybody remembers teeter-totters. This was on the playground when I was growing up, and if one kid sat on one side, this side went down, and then another kid on the other side, it went up, right, over like a lever action going on. We talk about that in gymnastics a lot. That actually they all say lever action, where as your body grabs the balance beam, your leg goes up in the air because you're trying to do a lever into a handstand. So that idea is the tension between cortisol and then the other hormone. It would be melatonin. Now, not secreted by the adrenals. It's secreted actually by the pineal gland in the brain. And basically, it goes high in the opposite cycle. It actually helps you fall asleep, and especially initiating sleep. And in the night, I think it spikes the highest secretion is around 2 to 3 a.m. in the morning. And then about an hour before you wake up, the secretion stops of melatonin. And then that's when cortisol takes off, right? So then you have this balancing effect. So what can happen, like I said, is if over time, cortisol can be too low under chronic stress. And so what you'll see is your black diamond ski slope for cortisol can be a flattened curve. So it can become more like the bunny slope, right? Where the time of day when you actually want cortisol to be highest, it's not high enough, right? It doesn't drive you out of bed in the morning. And then paradoxically though, later on when it's supposed to be lower and falling, it's higher really than it should be. So you have almost like not a whole lot of distinction between your high cortisol state and your low cortisol state. Talk about throwing off your circadian rhythm and confusing your body. That is such a state. So, one way, the other piece then, of course, if melatonin is too low, then, one doesn't initiate sleep so well. So you have those two kind of in tension. So it's worth thinking about the fact that, again, the HPA axis can get thrown off in different ways. Some of that's timing, right? Early on in stress, tendency is that it goes kind of high and is more a hypercortisol state. But then as stress persists, months, years for some of us, the same stress, you start to be able to identify it. That's good. That looks like something I'm familiar with. And then also, though, levels of cortisol can be paradoxically too low. And there are ways to support in terms of diet and nutrition, ways to help kind of eat foods that promote the replenishment of a lot of the things that cortisol, the secretion of cortisol depletes, so that you have the resources to make cortisol again. That's one reason that just supplementing with cortisol is not going to fix a problem. Giving cortisol, then your body still doesn't register or fix the fact that we're not making cortisol. In fact, sometimes it makes it worse. I mean, we see this with a lot of endocrine disorders in general, where you can cause an organ that's already struggling along to eke too much, to basically stop secreting, because a lot of the feedback mechanisms in the body are negative feedback loops. So you have, like for example, if you have TSH, which tells your thyroid to make thyroid and secrete it into the blood, right? So TSH goes high to tell the thyroid to secrete thyroid hormone. And what ends up that if you don't have thyroid hormone, it'll keep going higher and higher. That's one of the ways in labs we recognize, this person is probably hypothyroid. Thyroid is not functioning very well. But you can actually paradoxically cause the thyroid to just further poop out if you over supplement. If you end up kind of taking over and doing the work for the thyroid gland itself, then the thyroid doesn't really recover. An example, let me give an analogy from the gym, right? The analogy from the gym would be, if you have this skinny, scrawny little guy who is trying to lift a weight. Let's say he's doing the overhead military press, right? And he can't do it. So the big giant guy who's jacked comes over, and instead of just spotting him, he's really assisting him too much. That skinny, scrawny little guy is not ever going to get stronger, right? You have to assist a little bit so that then the skinny, scrawny guy can develop those muscles and can push it back out, can do the military press. Okay, that's my analogy. Same thing can happen in the body. If you supplement too much, if you got too much help, right? Oh, we'll just give you X amount of cortisol, then that will further, the levels that are being measured in the body are adequate. So then it's not gonna tell the adrenals really that they need to do more of their job, because they recognize that their job needs to be done more by the levels being low. That we have those kinds of feedback loops in the body. So don't shut them down totally. So that's all that to say. That's one reason why just supplementing with cortisol is not going to fix the problem. You have to address something deeper, which would be all the things that are going to support the body to make its own cortisol. So anyways, thanks for tuning in. Appreciate your support. Feel free to always, as always, share, comment, like. All of these are YouTube friendly. Adios.